We probably won't go that long in this message this evening. I'm not just trying to add up and see how many messages, how many tapes we can get in this series, but I have to try to make the divisions that need to be made between the language groups. We've talked about Syriac, we've talked about Coptic. Last time we were talking about Ulfilas and the Gothic Bible. And tonight we're going to be speaking about the Armenian translation, the Armenian version, A-R-M-E-N-I-A-N. And I don't have that much information because there's not that much information available on the Armenian Bible, but I hate to start this and finish it and then also start another language group and not be able to finish it. So we'll go a half hour, 45 minutes or whatever, and we'll probably be through. Again, we have to turn to Eusebius, H.E. 646, Ecclesiastical History 646, to gain an approximation for the date of the origin of Christianity in Armenia. And according to H.E. 646, Christianity had to have been there by at least the date A.D. 264. Here's our map of the Mediterranean again. This is Turkey. There's the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea over here. There's Jerusalem. Here's Antioch. This is Syria. We talked last time, well, it's kind of off the map, but it's way up here. We talked about the Gothic people. This here's somewhere around here, Mount Ararat, Noah's Ark, and all of this territory here. That's what we're speaking about when we're talking about Armenia. So we've gone in several, really in three different directions. We've gone to Syria, and this is essentially the same direction as far as the Bible translations are concerned. We've come down here for the Copts, for the Egyptian language. We've gone all the way up here with the work done by Ulfilas and basically creating a written alphabet for the Gothic people. Christianity probably, well, according to some traditions, either Thaddeus or Bartholomew were responsible for carrying it there, but there's really no support for either Thaddeus or Bartholomew. Probably Christianity spread into Armenia very early from its southern neighbor, which is Syria. We know that Christianity made its way to Syria very early, and probably Christianity spread from there northwardly into the northern neighbor of Syria, which is Armenia. What's Armenia known for? Well, Demas Shakarian, the founder of Full Gospel, was from Armenia. Noah's Ark, I guess, above everything. Armenia is not one of the most important or most significant past nations of the world. However, it was the first nation to officially recognize Christianity as its state religion. And this came about through the work of one Gregory the Illuminator, who's known as Gregory the Illuminator. Armenia is the first nation to officially recognize Christianity as its state religion. We'll explain kind of how that came about in giving you a little of the history of this man, Gregory the Illuminator. Remember, Ulfilas was the most important man in Gothic history from a Christian point of view. Gregory the Illuminator, along with Mesrob, M-E-S-R-O-B, will be to him here in a moment. Maybe his real name is Mushtotes, but we'll be to that in a moment, are the two significant people in Armenian Christian history. So notice how early in history this goes. We're back to the 3rd century A.D., A.D. 264. At least for a date of the introduction of Christianity into Armenia. The first nation to officially recognize it as a state religion. Gregory the Illuminator is the one responsible for this. Remember I said that Ulfilas sometimes is known as the apostle to the Goths. Well, Gregory the Illuminator is referred to as the apostle to the Armenians. He lived from A.D. 240 to 332. And he was of royal descent. Now there does happen to be a little interplay between some of the early history of this man and Ulfilas that we've talked about earlier, inasmuch as remember how Ulfilas' grandparents had been taken from the province of Cappadocia which is over here in Turkey in Asia Minor, up into present-day Romania or Bulgaria. Gregory the Illuminator was moved from his homeland of Armenia to Cappadocia. Ulfilas' grandparents were taken from Cappadocia and removed somewhere else. Just the reverse is happening with Gregory. He's of royal descent, but as a young child, he was moved from his homeland of Armenia. So he's a natural Armenian from birth, and was taken to be raised in Caesarea. Not the two Caesareas of Palestine, but the one Caesarea, the capital of Cappadocia, another Caesarea. Obviously, there are many, many Caesareas because they're all named after Caesar. Eventually, Gregory married. He had 2 sons, and upon the birth of his second son, decided to return to his natural people, the Armenians. This he does, and upon returning, the first thing that he's successful in, by the way, he becomes a Christian whenever he's in Caesarea of Cappadocia. Whenever he returns, he converts the ruling king of the Armenians, whose name was Tiridates III. Tiridates. He converts Tiridates. Tiridates. Tiridates III was the ruling king of Armenia from 284 to 314. Probably Gregory makes his trip from Caesarea of Cappadocia back to his homeland of Armenia and succeeds in converting the king, the ruling king Tiridates III, somewhere toward the end, maybe the last decade of the 3rd century A.D. So we're talking about somewhere from maybe 290 to 299. The dates on that are not that certain, but probably somewhere in this time range, from 290, the last decade of the 3rd century A.D., until 299, he makes his trip back to, with his whole family, of course, back to his homeland, which is only natural to return to his homeland. And there he's successful in converting Tiridates. He is appointed bishop of the Armenian Christians in A.D. 302. Christianity has been here for about 40 years. Somewhat over 40 years by the time Gregory the Illuminator arrives. So he's not the one who brings Christianity to the people. He's referred to as the apostle of, or the apostle to the Armenians, but he's not the one who actually brings Christianity. Christianity, as we've said, probably was brought by Armenia's southern neighbor, which is Syria. But he's the one who gets so much going as far as Christianity is concerned, the establishment of it, its recognition as state religion, and so forth, which does take place during the time of Gregory the Illuminator. The one who appoints him bishop is the Metropolitan of Caesarea of Cappadocia. This became a problem later, and eventually the Armenian church breaks from the Cappadocian or the Caesarean church back in Asia Minor. The Metropolitan of Caesarea, which is back over here in Turkey, is the one who actually appoints Gregory the Illuminator as the bishop. Now, by this time, if you're thinking maybe we're not really dealing with New Testament or anything like that, biblical understanding of things, but if you're thinking of terms like bishop, what does that mean? What did that mean? Well, it meant one thing in the New Testament. It meant one thing in the 1st century A.D., and it's meant something entirely else and entirely different since that time, even up until modern times. Bishop does not really mean the same thing as it meant in New Testament times. So bishop in New Testament times, of course, was a pastor over a local group of people. Bishop by this time is similar to a metropolitan, which was a man who controlled a large territory of Christianity. That is, the Christians in the confines of that territory would be under his spiritual oversee. And what became a sore point later on, of course, was the fact that the Armenian church felt itself in subjection to, and really it was, and really it had to be, because of the fact that Gregory the Illuminator not only had come from Cappadocia, from Caesarea here in Cappadocia, but he also was appointed as bishop of the Armenian church and the Armenian Christians by the Metropolitan in Caesarea.
So there was a sore point between the Armenian church. They eventually later break in history from the church back in Cappadocia. However, this appointment of him as bishop remains in his family for quite some time, for many, many years. That is, one of his sons then took his place when he died, and one of his son's sons, and that went down for several generations. His son represented the Armenian Christians at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. You see, it's historical points like that give us a lot of information, a lot in comparison to nothing, I guess I could say, about whether or not these nations, these people in these nations, are of a Christian background. We saw this true with the Goths. We kind of can date their early Christianity because of the fact that they had one, Theophilus, who represented them at the Council of Nicaea. It was really, well, outside of the Council of Jerusalem, which is, a book of Acts, 1st century, AD 49 to AD 50, gathering together of Christians, and it was really basically something local that takes place there in Jerusalem. The Council of Nicaea was the first Catholic, small c, first ecumenical, first of a large order gathering together of Christian leaders to, of course, deal with the Arian heresy. So Christians had to be from all over the world, all over the Mediterranean world. That basically was the confines of Christianity then, had to be represented by leaders from their midst. So if we can find lists, and we do have lists of the names of various bishops and their origins, sometimes you can tell just from the name where they're from, the names of these various bishops from the Council of Nicaea, then we can tell what countries, what groups of people are represented here. So his son is at Nicaea in 325. So we're 75 years past the earliest date for what we know to be the introduction of Christianity into Armenia. Now this Tiridates III was an interesting man. Formerly he had been a tremendous, like the man Saul, persecutor of the Christians in Armenia, which lets us know that Christianity existed prior to the return of Gregory. He had been a tremendous, rather successful, in the evil sense of the term, persecutor of the Christian religion. The king, Tiridates III. Tiridates III, who ruled from 284 to 314. He was the one Gregory converts whenever Gregory returns to his homeland. Now I mentioned earlier that Armenia has the noted distinction of being the first nation to officially recognize Christianity as a state religion. That's not as beautiful as it sounds, because, to make a religion the state religion means that pretty much everyone has to follow that religion, whether they're saved or not saved. You're just born into that country, and therefore you're born into that religion. I don't really mean anything great or positive by that, but it is a distinction to be known by. It's not Mexico, it's not Palestine, it's not Syria, it's not Italy, it's not Greece. It's Armenia, which is known as the first nation that recognized Christianity officially as a state religion. But how they did this, was as follows, and that's the subject of mass baptisms. We see a lot of that in the Crusade era. Several hundred years in the beginning of the second millennia AD. Mass baptisms brought all the country into Christianity. And, of course, this was under the spiritual leadership of Gregory and the political leadership of Tiridates III. He had been a persecutor. Now he's the one who opens up his country's rivers and lakes and streams into which the people were baptized. And how this would be conducted, you probably already are familiar with this, but political, military, soldier type leaders would be sent out from the king. They sent out to various villages where there were a group of people. And in ancient history, it's still true somewhat today, but particularly in ancient history, because of a lack of means of good transportation, almost all cities were built near a body of water, particularly a river where you could navigate up and down. If not a river, you were built by a pond, by a lake, by a sea, by an ocean, by something like that. So you'd be sent, these military leaders, just like soldiers, would be sent with a sword to a village, and you'd put the sword to the people's neck and said, "Receive Christ or die." So that's how you become all Christians there. And then you just herd everyone right out into the lake, and everyone dunks under, and there everyone's baptized now. You bring everybody back into the city, and that makes it a Christian city. Of course, a lot of that goes on in medieval history, but here's some of the origins of that. Maybe the first time, I don't know. But here's some of the origins of that way back early in Armenian history. Enough on Gregory. Let's come to another man of importance. We're working our way towards the Armenian translation. Gregory, the apostle of the Armenians. Mesrob, M-E-S-R-O-B, is the next important figure who enters the scene. His real name is Mashtots, M-A-S-H-T-O-T-Z. But by strange circumstances of translation, he's generally referred to not as Mashtots, but as Mesrob, M-E-S-R-O-B. All right, we had last time Ulfilas in the Gothic Bible. Now we have Mesrob, M-E-S-R-O-B, Mesrob in the Armenian Bible. He lived from 361, so he overlaps the date of Gregory the Illuminator, to 439. He earlier had been a soldier. He exchanged a military life for that of a churchman in Armenia. And he, along with a friend, or really I should say his friend along with him. His friend was the one who initiated it, but Mesrob is the most famous of the two names, and it's to him the credit generally is given. One Sahak, S-A-H-A-K. Sahak, which was their spelling of Isaac, I-S-A-A-C. That just means Isaac in Armenian. Who lived A.D. 350 to 439. Sahak along with Mesrob, or Isaac along with Mashtots, created a working alphabet of 36 letters in the year A.D. 406. Remember how Ulfilas had created an alphabet, borrowing from Greek, from Latin, and from some Gothic runes to give the Gothic language its written form. Well, it's to Isaac, or Sahak, particularly to Mesrob, M-E-S-R-O-B, that we are indebted for the creation of the written Armenian alphabet, one of 36 letters. And it also borrowed from earlier languages like Greek and Latin. You really had to borrow from something, just like the English alphabet itself is a borrowed alphabet. Created it in 406. The next thing that Mesrob did, he gathered scholars around him and sent them throughout the world looking for good manuscripts. You see, the reason, just like Ulfilas, the basic reason that Ulfilas gave us a Gothic alphabet was not so that the children could learn the 3 R's in school, but so that he could teach the people the alphabet and they could read a Bible, the very Bible that he was going to translate into their language, so that they could read that in the future. Well, this is the same idea behind the creation of the Armenian alphabet by Mesrob. He's not doing it as a humanitarian, friendly gesture toward the people. He wants to translate the Bible for them, provide the Bible, the Christian scriptures for the Christian people in Armenia. And to do that, you have to have a written alphabet. You have to have a Bible translated into that alphabet, and then eventually the people will have to learn that. Before you can translate a Bible, you have to have some manuscripts. You have to have some manuscript before you that you can use as the basis of your translation. So he sent scholars throughout the world to places like Edessa and to Rome to gather together the best available manuscripts. That is, the best known to them, the best ones available to them of what they knew. Now, you know where Rome is. Where's Edessa? Where have you heard that term before? Syria. That was one of the chief places of Christianity over in Syria. Edessa, E-D-E-S-S-A. They created the alphabet in 406. They start translating the Bible immediately, before the people even learn it. They start translating the Bible immediately. Well, you've got 66 choices. What was the first book they translated? No? You'd never get it unless you took 66 tries. Maybe you'd get it by the 41st. Proverbs. We don't really know why, but the first book done was the book of Proverbs. Proverbs was followed by the New Testament in the order of the Gospels, and then the rest of the material, and this was followed by the remainder of the Old Testament. All that had not been done, and the only thing that had been done was the book of Proverbs. So the order was Proverbs, New Testament, rest of the Old Testament. It was all completed sometime around AD 410. It took them only about 4 years to do this. So, for our date of the Armenian Bible, 5th century. Very early 5th century, the first decade of the 5th century AD. AD 410. There's the history of Gregory the Illuminator and Mesrab. Next of all, let's come to the translation that Mesrab gave us. It was probably done at first from Syriac manuscripts. Notice they did not go somewhere in Greece. They did not go to Palestine. Maybe most importantly, they did not go to Constantinople. They went to Rome. They went to Edessa. Now, Rome is a long way off. Edessa is not very far from Armenia at all. So probably at first the translation was done from Syriac manuscripts, which therefore makes it a secondary translation. The Armenian Bible is a secondary translation, not nearly as reliable and therefore not nearly as important for textual studies. After the Council of Ephesus in AD 431, see, their work has been done between 406 and 410. And they don't have, what they need, of course, are some good Greek manuscripts. The Old Testament's really not that important. What they need to do is get the New into the language of the people. But they don't have Greek, they're using Syriac. Probably most of those are from Edessa. Maybe they have even some Latin ones from Rome. Probably a few Greek ones, but they don't have good ones or reliable ones. And they recognize this. And so after the Council of Ephesus in AD 431, 2 Armenian scholars returned. They had been here at this council, and they returned with some more reliable Greek codices from Constantinople. Constantinople and Ephesus are not that far apart in distance at all. And on the basis of these more reliable Greek codices, we know that the whole work of the Armenian Bible was revised. However, it does not seem to have taken place immediately after their return, which would be the middle of the 5th century AD. All we can say is that it was done sometime prior to the 8th century, sometime prior to the 700s AD. And here's the importance of all of this. Since the extant manuscripts of the Armenian Bible today date only back to the 9th century, that means that we have lost forever the text of the original early Armenian translation. All we have now is a revised. It happens to probably be better since it's based on more reliable Greek codices that were brought from Constantinople, which was kind of like the literary or learning center of the world then in Constantinople. So you can see how important a transition this is. We would like to know what that earlier Armenian Bible had because it's probably based on Syriac manuscripts, and then we could compare that with what we know to exist in Syriac translations in. Then we can compare that with Greek and see how reliable it is. But since the manuscripts that are extant for the Armenian Bible date only back to the 9th century, it just means that we've lost forever the original early Armenian text of the Bible. Okay, manuscripts. F.G. Kenyon, one of the famous early scholars, the early part of this century, has a statement in his book, Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts. It's not an easy book to find, and it's really outdated. It's definitely outdated by the more recent reliable ones, but he was one of the early ones. He was kind of a pioneer in biblical manuscripts. Frederick G. Kenyon has a statement in his book, Our Bible and the Ancient Manuscripts, page 237. which is back several decades ago, where he says that Armenian manuscripts are relatively rare. The reason I'm pointing this one statement out is because it's so false. It's not true at all. E.F. Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S, gave us a list of Armenian manuscripts in 1959. E.F. Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S, in 1959 gave us a list of Armenian manuscripts which numbered 1,244. Do you remember how much Gothic material is extant today?
180.
Less than 300 pages, 280 pages, less than 300 pages available. Here, this isn't pages, this is manuscripts, 1,244. Now, Gothic is relatively rare, but Armenian is rather plentiful. 1,244 manuscripts. That was in 1959. The largest collection in the United States happens to belong to a private collector who, as far as I know, is still around, Mr. Harry Kurdian, K-U-R-D-I-A-N. Mr. Harry Kurdian of Wichita, Kansas, that in the last count, 1975, numbered 59 complete manuscripts of the New Testament and 41 with parts of the New Testament. How would you like to have that in your own private library? 100 Armenian manuscripts. That's the largest collection in the United States. Now, I don't break all this down with all of the language groups and say where the largest collection exists. I just thought that was an interesting point, that the largest one in the U.S. belongs to a private citizen, a private collector, Harry Kurdian of Wichita, Kansas, which 11 years ago numbered 59 Armenian completes of the New Testament and 41 of parts. Here are some of the notable Armenian manuscripts. The oldest dated Armenian manuscript, and they go by, many times they'll go by a Rhodes number, because E.F. Rhodes gave us a classification of them in 1959. Sometimes they don't go by that. The oldest dated one is Rhodes number 991. R-H-O-D-E-S. Rhodes number 991, which contains the four Gospels and dates to A.D. 887, the end of the 9th century. The 9th century, remember, that's the earliest century for Armenian manuscripts that are extant. So this is, if not the oldest one, it's one of the oldest. It's the oldest dated one. Whether that makes it the oldest, we're not for certain, but it has to be one of the oldest if it's not the oldest. Remember now that all the manuscripts are from the 9th century or later. And let's say this, probably the Gospels are the ones that go back earliest, from the 9th century and shortly after that. Other portions of the New Testament are generally much later than the 9th century, much later than the Gospels. So that's the oldest dated Armenian manuscript, and it is of the four Gospels. Okay, secondly, the oldest of the rest of the New Testament. Acts, Pauline, General, and Revelation. Pauline epistles and the general epistles, or the Catholic. I guess you should say Catholic, since we have to go by the EAPCR description. Oldest of Acts, Pauline, Catholic, and Revelation is a bilingual Greek and Armenian, which today is in Paris. The Greek dates from the 11th century, the Armenian from the 12th century. Now, there are about 1,242 other Armenian manuscripts, but they're not that important, and so many of them come way up into the 14th and 15th centuries. They only date back that far. So they're just not that reliable at all. There are several peculiar characteristics about Armenian manuscripts, and it's it's these characteristics sometimes that help us date the manuscripts. First of all, many, if not most, of the Armenian manuscripts have colophons attached to them. And in the colophons, we are provided with the date of the text. A colophon, remember, is an ending. Maybe the scribe will give his name. Maybe the scribe will give us a date there. Maybe the scribe will give a little benediction, a little blessing of the Lord upon those who read his translation and who does not tamper with his translation, things like that. That's one peculiarity of the Armenian translations. Many of the manuscripts end with colophons, and these give us dates, and that helps us date these. Another characteristic is the inclusion of many non-canonical texts. Here are some examples. The history of Joseph, you'll recognize some of these as pseudepigraphal works here. The history of Joseph is included in many Armenian manuscripts. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, and in the New Testament times, the letter of the Corinthians to Paul. Which letter is that? Can someone explain that for us? Pardon? No, not that. The letter of the Corinthians to Paul. The one Paul's answering. If you're turning your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. 1 Corinthians is really divided into halves. The first 6 chapters and then chapters 7 through the end of the book. We know that because in chapter 1, verse 11, Paul says, "It's been declared to me by them which are of the house of Chloe that there are contentions among you." This must have been personal report. I mean, from someone from the Corinthian church to the Apostle Paul. Contentions, divisions. Well, you kind of know that happens in chapters 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then in 5 we know we have some contentions and divisions there, and in chapter 6 over lawsuits and fornication we have some contentions there. And then in chapter 7, now he writes this, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me." So there must be 2 sources of knowledge for the Apostle Paul in writing 1 Corinthians, our 1 Corinthians here. Remember, according to chapter 5 and verse 9, there was an earlier Corinthians, so that our 1 Corinthians is really a 2 Corinthians. In chapter 5 and verse 9 we read, "I wrote unto you in an epistle, not to company with fornicators." But he doesn't talk about fornicators in this epistle. Many scholars say that this really, the Greek here can really be translated that this is the epistle that he has reference to. He doesn't talk about fornication until the next chapter, though. He said, "I wrote to you in an earlier epistle." So there's 1 Corinthians. Here's 2 Corinthians. We call it first because it's our first. But he writes, "Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me." Then he goes on, "It's not good for a man to touch a woman." And he deals, of course, all in chapter 7 here with the case of marriage and what happens in marriage and the blessings and the curses of marriage versus celibacy and the positives and the negatives and all of this. And then, in chapters 8, 9, and 10 he goes into the liberty question. Then in chapter 11 he goes into head covering and the communion service. 12 to 14 he goes into gifts. And in chapter 15 he goes into the doctrine of the resurrection. In chapter 16 we have a conclusion. So this is the letter of the Corinthians to Paul. Now we, you see, could write our own. We'd start in the letter and we'd start writing things about marriage. And we'd be asking, now, Apostle Paul, should we get married? Should we not get married? What are the positives and the negatives? Then our next paragraph would say something about eating meats offered to idols. That's chapters 8, 9, and 10. The next one would talk something about the head covering. We've got women that aren't wearing the head covering in our church. Or what are we supposed to do here? And then the next paragraph would be on the communion. The next paragraph would be on the gifts. The next one on the resurrection. And we could write our own letter. So someone in ancient history has forged a letter of the Corinthians to Paul to answer this one verse here, to supply the missing link in this one verse, 1 Corinthians 7:1. "Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me." So many Armenian manuscripts have such an epistle, the letter of the Corinthians to Paul, and it reads similar to what I just outlined. And furthermore, we're talking about an inclusion of non-canonical texts. They also have another Corinthians, that is another letter to the Corinthians from the Apostle Paul, so-called 3 Corinthians. I think we've seen before that there are probably as many as 4 Corinthians. But this is the earlier one, 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. And as late as the 13th century A.D., 3 Corinthians was still read at the Armenian Mass. 3 Corinthians was still read at the Armenian Mass as late as the 13th century A.D. Okay, our little diagram here and we'll be through. It is an EAPC armed group, the Evangelist, Acts, Pauline, Catholic, and Revelation. It'll be abbreviated in your critical apparatus at the bottom of the page as ARM, A-R-M, Armenian. Dates from the early 5th century. The first decade of the 5th century A.D., around 410 A.D.